Disclaimer. This is a subject that will most likely spark a flame in a lot of people's eyes and keyboards. So before we actually get started, try to keep it civil when you charge into the comments to attack anyone who thinks differently than you. Okay, with that out of the way, let's talk about this. So now that my 2 weeks were up with my very first iPhone, I've made some conclusions that I'm confident sticking with regarding the age-old question: iPhone or Android? And just to try to get the full picture, I asked around a bunch of people who also own iPhones what drives them towards iOS. And I mainly asked that side of the story because I'm less familiar with iOS myself, having very limited experience with it. And let me emphasize, this is not a comparison between specific phones. This is just a general comparison between the OSs. Okay? So first of all, when you look at the various aspects between the OSs, there is a pattern that emerges in the comparison. And that is choice versus conformity. And that applies in both the good and the bad in both cases. Let me explain. When starting from the ground up with the phone selection itself, when you look at the iPhone, you have a rather narrow selection. Most people opt for the newest one, so the only question you need to ask is, do I need the Pro or not? And then, do I want the big one or not? So while you do have a selection, it is pretty narrow most of the time. Now, if you want something cheaper, you opt in for the SE model, but that's still pretty expensive compared to some of the cheaper phones in general. So if you want something cheaper, you opt in for the SE model, but if you want the specs, the flagship stuff, then you need to opt in for the Pro model or the happy between with the basic models. And opting in higher than the SE will cost you significantly. So it usually isn't too difficult to choose a new phone when you're an iPhone user. With Android, on the other hand, there are a lot of brands that put out a lot of different phones in many different price categories. So there is definitely a phone for every single budget out there, from the extremely expensive to the extreme budget tier. Now, while this is great for enthusiasts who want to dive into the technology and want to know everything there is to know about phones, this is a nightmare for the average user that just wants a decent phone and they don't want to learn everything about phones. But on the other hand, this huge selection also offers a plethora of novelty phones with specific aiming goals in the Android department. So if you want a phone that is meant for gaming, done. If you want a super sturdy, will never break, done. If you want a phone that has a 1-inch camera sensor, done. And none of these specific use cases are covered on the iOS side, but the phones that you do have do everything pretty well to really well. Also, Android is still heavily favoring the big phone size, so if you want something more compact, iPhone still reigns king. With some exceptions. That one being the Asus Zenfone 9, which has flagship specs in a small form factor. So I know that is only one example, but we can only hope that it's one example so far. Maybe this is a sign of better days to come for us who don't want a freaking tablet as a phone. So like I said at the start, with Android, you have a massive, potentially even overwhelming amount of choice, but with iPhone, you need to conform to Apple's selection of very few but very capable phones. Then when you start comparing the operating systems themselves, you see the same pattern. It's well established that iPhone's customization has always been extremely limited compared to Android. They've been making some advancements in that area, but they're still nowhere near the same level. So basically, Android gives you a platform that you can make your own in any way that you want, while the iPhone gives you a platform that you can tweak to get a somewhat personalized experience. So when I was using the iPhone, I was actually constantly missing the customization options because, well, I have a very minimalistic approach as well as variety of functions that I seek in a phone. So the fact that I couldn't make something as simple as a custom order with my apps, I couldn't make a quick access to settings without it being ginormous. I couldn't get rid of the tint on the bottom bar, or I couldn't even find a single useful widget in the whole phone. I was extremely relieved to go back to my Android. Then again, the fact that you can do so much customization on an Android can get you in trouble if you don't know what you're doing. I mean, it is absolutely amazing what kind of things the elderly can make happen with smartphones. Not in a good way. But on the topic of the elderly, the fact that iOS now forces everyone to use the swipe navigation just completely shuts out the possibility of me recommending an iPhone for my grandparents ever. At least on Android, they have the option to still have the simple buttons to press. Because swipe navigation, with the way that I've seen so many elderly people use a phone, that's never gonna happen. Sure, there are gonna be exceptions to the case, but for most, not happening. So with the OS's customization, we arrive at the same rule right here. With Android, you have the choice to make your phone look like and act like whatever you want, with the risk of hurting yourself in your own confusion. But with Apple and iOS, you need to conform to Apple's idea of what your phone should look like. So that can be a powerful incentive. Now, those being the biggest things, there are still some smaller but still very important things that you need to consider. These days, the iOS is much more stable argument is less relevant than ever, with Android being more stable than they've been to some extent, and with more weird things happening with iOS. I mean, I only had the 13 Pro for a couple of weeks and several apps crashed on me. But that experience is just different with the different OSs. With iPhones and iOS, the apps just close. There's no notification. But with Android, you get a notification telling you that this thing isn't working. Close app. So to a normal user, iPhone's approach that just might make it seem more stable and more trustworthy. And that's not to mention the several instances so far where Apple's new updates on the older iPhones have just straight up broken things, like notifications. Now, that's not to say that Android is without issues, not at all. That's just to point out that iPhone may not be the stable, safe haven that it's been so far. Well, how about iPhone's specialty features like iMessage, FaceTime, or AirDrops? Well, in my case, I live in Finland, and in our country, pretty much every phone plan is unlimited, and the majority of phones are Android phones. So iMessage is irrelevant, to say the least. All of the people that I know who own iPhones that I talk to never use it, because WhatsApp is just so prevalent here. Now, a feature that people said that they prefer over Android's option is FaceTime, but the amount of times that they've used FaceTime is very small. But one thing that they all said that is fantastic is AirDrop, and I have to agree. The technology behind AirDrop is absolutely fantastic, so that point definitely goes to Apple and iOS. Yet, no Android user that I've actually spoken to has ever talked about switching to an iPhone just for AirDrop. So it is a great point for Apple. It's just not something that is a necessity. Lastly, I really didn't think that I'd have to point something like this out, but after making the mistake of reading a lot of different discussions about this topic, I grew annoyed at how often I saw this card being played. Okay, so, come here. If you think that the only reason why somebody doesn't buy an iPhone is that they're poor, you are an idiot. If you disregard all the points that I've laid out before you until now, at least listen to this. Not everyone cares about their phones as much as you do. For some people, a phone is just a tool. Something to call, text message, read emails, and occasionally browse the internet with. If that is the only thing you're using your phone for, why would you spend a lot of money on it? It makes no sense. Also, there are Android users with more expensive phones than your iPhone, so I guess they could call you poor. Food for thought. Alright, sorry for going on a bit of a tangent there, but it was shocking how many times I saw people bring up that point. But that's everything I have to say about the OSs. Both are great options, but there are simply cases where only one of the OSs fulfills the needs of the person buying a phone. For me, that is Android. But after using iOS for a while, I know that it's a great OS. It's just not for me. And what do you know? We can actually agree to disagree. We have different needs. Who'd have thought? Now, I hope this video helped you see both sides of the fence to some extent. If it did, just make sure you thunk that like button and consider subscription. Who knows? But let me know in the comments what you think of the different OSs, but like I said, keep it civil. We can talk about this like semi-decent adults. Neither is the correct answer. The only correct answer is this one is for you. All right, I hope you all have a great rest of your week, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.